Every single relationship ever has metaphors. You know how this works, whether you're talking about your relationship with your parents, a friend, or a spouse, loved one, anybody. There are things that when you get to know somebody well enough, you're like, oh, they did that. And I know that that means that they understand me and that they care about me. And they know that I'll know that it means those things. That's really cool. And then also every relationship ever worth its salt has negative metaphors where it's like, I have wanted this to be a thing that you would understand about me or that you would get that has been a point of tension forever, and yet you keep doing this subtle thing that isn't that big a deal. It's not really that big a deal. It's just the subtle message that it sends is that you don't care about this thing or that you're not listening and that we have tension. These kind of living metaphors are part of the ebb and flow, part of the beauty of really intimately knowing someone so that to an outsider, they could look at the metaphors and be like, it's just that, or it's just that. Don't get so excited. Don't get so upset. It's not that big a deal. But if you really know those dance steps, you're like, no, there's just tremendous opportunity in the mundane, in the little things to say, I love you, or to be hurtful and twist the knife a little bit if you want to. Likewise, in the Bible, you've got a whole bunch of these little living metaphors that exist in the relationship between God and his chosen people. And those little metaphors to an outsider might just look like nothing. I don't know. I don't see why anybody would really care or get that worked up about this thing or that thing. But when you know the history of the relationship and you know that stuff means stuff, you realize that, dang, you make that remark about that little seemingly mundane thing, and that's got some pretty significant implications if you're paying attention. That's exactly what we're running into here in Matthew chapter 21 with this bizarre incident about the fig tree that I say again to outsiders is probably one of the weirder little anecdotes in the entire story of Jesus in any of the gospel accounts. But to the original audience to whom Matthew was writing, that being a 1st century AD Jewish audience steeped in the history of the relationship between their people and God and completely fluent in all of the little metaphors that exist in that relationship, this little anecdote about this fig tree carries a whole lot of meaning. So here's a passage I'm talking about. Once again, Jesus has just gone into Jerusalem. He's been welcomed enthusiastically by people who don't totally get who he is exactly, but they're excited about it anyway. He goes right into the temple and clears it of money changers and people doing business in there. Then the religious leaders are super mad because he's ruining their Passover party. And the little kids are way too excited and saying stuff that sounds way too messianic for their tastes. And they try to get Jesus to denounce it. And he's like, no, they're pretty much right on. And then he references some more messianic stuff from Psalm 8. And then he goes back out to Bethany where he's staying. And then he's on his way back into Jerusalem after an overnight out there. And then we pick it up in verse 18 and it says this: early in the morning, as he was on his way back to the city, that's Jerusalem, Jesus was hungry. Seeing a fig tree by the road, he went up to it, but found nothing on it except leaves. Then he said to it, may you never bear fruit again. And immediately the tree withered. When the disciples saw this, they were amazed. How did the fig tree wither so quickly? They asked. And that's what we thought about last time around. Jesus replied, I tell you the truth. If you have faith and don't doubt, not only can you do what was done to this fig tree, but also you can say to this mountain, go throw yourself into the sea, and it'll be done. If you believe, you'll receive whatever you ask for in prayer. Now, probably a lot of you are like, I don't know. Guy prayed for some stuff and it did not happen. And I really believed it. It seems like logic would dictate that if people over the centuries really believed stuff, and they probably did, and prayed really earnestly for it, and they probably did, that history would look a lot different. Like all the wars would get canceled. Everybody would have fancy toilets made of gold that have bidets attached to them. Everyone would have a successful modeling career and everyone would love them. There's no caveat here about like, well, it has to be praying within, the will of God. It has to be like a really Christian prayer. There's nothing there. We're going to have to go out to a larger context to figure out what the parameters are here, what Jesus is even actually talking about. And so to understand how this would have resonated to the original audience and to understand what Jesus is driving at and whether we're just getting this carte blanche access to the unlimited power of God for whatever purposes we want, or whether he maybe means something a little bit more specific here, we have to look into the metaphor. We got to look into the stuff that means stuff that pops on this page. And what we're getting here is nowhere close to the first living metaphor spiritual truth in action, not in story form, but like live action spiritual truth metaphor that we've seen in the Bible. And we've seen a ton of this stuff. And one that comes to mind for two purposes that will become evident as we go along, is the entire metaphor that we get in the book of Hosea. Hosea is an Old Testament prophet who operated in the 8th century BC when the big out-of-town threat was Assyria, but also when the nation of Israel, this is part of the split kingdom, so Israel is the northern kingdom, Judah is the southern kingdom. In Kings and Chronicles, we get a list of all of their kings, most of whom were relatively lousy, even though they might have had some material or military success, or just overwhelmingly gross and morally bankrupt. And especially in the north, it was gross. It was awful. But they were crazy rich. And so Hosea is this guy who comes on the scene in the equivalent of the roaring 1990s of the United States or Western civilization. Everybody's getting richer. We're not really connected to the larger world yet. And so it looks like we've got unending material wealth. And in terms of morality, like we don't have to worry about survival anymore. And so we just start making up new things to believe because we're bored and we want to be entertained. Politics and sex and material lavishness go off the rails into Weirdville in all sorts of ways, and things start to break. Now, you might be saying, well, that sounds like really narrow conservatism on your part as you reflect on the recent decades of the American cultural world and the West in general, and that's not really where I'm coming from at all. Objectively, there were certain things that were non-negotiable, relatively grounded principles of growth. Objectively, we reached some kind of zenith of wealth and opulence somewhere in the 90s or 2000s, and objectively, we're going through some kind of weird reckoning with our money and our stuff and our not knowing how to get along or function as people anymore. Objectively, we're going through some kind of weird moral crisis where we don't know what to believe or why to believe. And objectively, we are cannibalizing each other. And objectively, we imagined our walls to have been unassailable from the mid-20th century until very recently. We harnessed the power of the sun, or the inverse power of the sun, to annihilate other people and to absolutely decisively end the biggest conflict the world has ever seen. And that makes you feel like there are no barbarians at the gates. We can do this all day long. But then something has happened in recent years where suddenly people are like, dang, I see cracks. This might not be forever. We might not only not be able to stave off destruction from without, we might not even be able to stave off destruction from within. What is going on, Western civilization? If you get this moment that we are living through right now, and if you get what is still alive in cultural memory for us right now, then I think you get Hosea's world. People are just starting to look at this opulence and this comfortability, and they're starting to look at the storm clouds gathering on the horizon culturally and in terms of other countries' military might. And they're like, I don't know if that can continue to work. I guess eat, drink, and be merry. But it seems like there's some trouble ahead. And so Hosea comes into this world and says very unpopular things to the leadership at the time because they want to stay in zenith of civilization and comfort of wealth mode forever. They don't understand that there's a price to pay for that and that price is coming down the pike quickly. Now, tomorrow, I'm going to frame up everything about this whole larger Hosea story, but for today, given the time, I don't want to cheat you out of the actual connection here for how we got to Hosea. Here's a pretty famous line in the early going of this living metaphor that is the book of Hosea. It's a living metaphor about a guy who God told to go and marry a prostitute. No joke. That was the deal. I don't think God was punishing Hosea. I think God wanted to make a point. That living metaphor actually happened and was playing out before people's eyes. And so in the early going, in chapter 2 of Hosea, when we get into the actual prophetic stuff after the story setup of chapter 1, we get this pronouncement of guilt and response to what went wrong in this marriage between Gomer and Hosea that immediately goes south because Gomer's not ready to be done prostituting. So she keeps doing that stuff. and gets into all sorts of trouble that we'll cover next time. But here's one of the prophetic judgments against the situation, and it's evident from the get-go that we're not just talking about Gomer here. We're talking about a living metaphor for the relationship between God and the northern expression of his chosen people in the nation of Israel. In verse 10 of Hosea chapter 2, it says, "So now I will expose her lewdness before the eyes of her lovers. No one will take her out of my hands. I will stop all her celebrations, her yearly festivals, her new moons, her Sabbath days, all her appointed feasts. I will ruin her vines and her fig trees, which she said were her pay from her lovers. I will make them a thicket, and wild animals will devour them. I will punish her for the days she burned incense to the Baals. She decked herself with rings and jewelry and went after her loaves. But me she forgot, declares the Lord." This is not some kind of fundamentalism where the point of the text is to go and get after anybody who got anything wrong in one of the hardest areas of life to get everything right. No, not at all. No, what you're getting here is an indictment of the people of Israel who have rejected their God. They chased after all of this lavishness, all of this silly stuff. They used unholy unions with people who did not care about these things to make it happen, and it got to a point where they loved material things so much. They loved themselves so much. They loved pleasure and lavishness so much that they forgot their actual God. And so this metaphor would have stung profoundly. And of course, you caught the part in the middle about the vines and the fig trees. This is not the only place in the Old Testament where a fig tree is used as some sort of living metaphor to describe the fruitfulness and the productivity of the people of Israel when getting it right in their relationship with God, and the fruitlessness and uselessness of such a tree when they are not upholding their end of the covenant and getting things right with God. And as is so often and frustratingly the case, we don't have that much time, which is part of the fun of the format. So we're just going to pause here, and we're going to pick it up, continuing to work through this Old Testament stuff that I think is imagery being referenced and drawn on here in this little passage in Matthew chapter 21 next time around. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.